Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. The evening was like any other for Cindy Walters, a vibrant and ambitious waitress working at a modest bar in a small town. The bar bustled with its usual crowd, locals winding down from a long day, exchanging stories over drinks, and the occasional out-of-towner stopping by for a quick meal. Cindy had grown accustomed to the rhythmic chaos, expertly balancing trays of drinks while flashing her warm, inviting smile at every patron. She prided herself on being good at her job, even if deep down she knew this wasn't where she had envisioned herself. That night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the door swung open, and in walked Jackson Peters, a sharply dressed young man who instantly stood out in the room. The bar's regulars, clad in flannel shirts and jeans, cast fleeting glances at him. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and commanding aura weren't common in this town. He looked like someone who belonged in a high-rise office, not in a dimly lit small-town bar. Cindy noticed him immediately, her trained eyes picking up on the details. The way he carried himself, confident yet slightly weary, hinted at a long day. His gaze swept the room briefly before he settled into a corner booth away from the crowd. She hesitated for a moment, curious about him, before grabbing her notepad and heading over. "Good evening," she said with her usual cheerful tone. "What can I get for you tonight?" Jackson looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment, Cindy felt a strange jolt, something she couldn't quite place. He smiled faintly. "Just a whiskey neat," he replied, his voice low and smooth. As she walked back to the bar to fetch his drink, she found herself wondering about him. Who was he? What brought him here? People like him rarely wandered into places like this. It wasn't long before her curiosity got the better of her. When she returned with his drink, she lingered slightly longer than usual. "Passing through town?" she asked casually, trying not to sound too inquisitive. Jackson chuckled lightly, taking a sip of his drink. "Something like that. Business trip. Busy day. You could say that." He paused, studying her for a moment. "And you, long shift?" Cindy smiled, surprised by the question. Most customers didn't bother to ask about her. "Always is, but I manage," she replied with a shrug. What started as small talk gradually deepened into a genuine conversation. Jackson found himself drawn to Cindy's wit and the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed. Cindy, in turn, was captivated by his charm and the glimpses of vulnerability he let slip through his polished exterior. The hours seemed to melt away as they talked about everything and nothing, dreams, regrets, and the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. By the time the bar began to empty, Cindy found herself reluctant to end the night. She had never felt this comfortable, disconnected, with someone she had just met. Jackson, too, felt an inexplicable pull toward her, a rare sense of ease he hadn't experienced in years. As the clock struck midnight, Cindy clocked out, grabbing her jacket. Jackson, still seated in the corner, looked up at her. "Done for the night?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yeah," she replied, hesitating. She didn't want to leave, but what reason did she have to stay? "Can I walk you home?" he offered, surprising even himself. Cindy blinked, caught off guard. She studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded. "Sure." The cool night air wrapped around them as they stepped out of the bar. The streets were quiet, the occasional chirp of crickets filling the silence. They walked side by side, their conversation picking up where it had left off. Cindy found herself sharing things she hadn't told anyone in years, her dreams of leaving the small town, her fears of being stuck. Jackson listened intently, offering words of encouragement that felt genuine. When they reached her small apartment, they lingered at the doorstep, the air heavy with unspoken words. Cindy looked up at him, her heart pounding. She didn't know what had come over her, but she didn't want the night to end. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson hesitated, his mind racing. He knew this was a crossroads, a moment he couldn't take back. But as he looked into her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "Yeah," he said finally. As the door closed behind them, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet glow of the moment. Neither could have predicted how that night would shape their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Cindy Walters sat on a bench in the town park, watching her son Ethan chase after a butterfly with boundless energy. She smiled faintly as the sunlight danced off his dark, wavy hair, a feature that always reminded her of someone she wished she could forget. Ethan was her whole world, a curious, mischievous 8-year-old with a smile that could light up the darkest day. But as much as she adored him, there were moments like this when his uncanny resemblance to Jackson Peters stirred a mix of emotions, pride, regret, and a lingering ache she couldn't quite shake. Life in their small town had settled into a steady rhythm. Cindy worked hard to provide for Ethan, juggling shifts at the diner and sewing gigs she picked up on the side. She had long made peace with the life she built, a modest one, but one filled with love. She didn't have time to dwell on the past or the man who had unknowingly left her with a reminder of that single night. That afternoon was supposed to be like any other. Ethan would tire himself out at the park, and they would head home for dinner. But life, as Cindy had learned over the years, rarely went according to plan. Unbeknownst to her, Jackson Peters was in town again. Now a self-assured millionaire, he had returned to finalize a business deal, never imagining he would stumble into a past he thought had long been left behind. After a tense morning at meetings, he decided to take a breather and explore the town. Walking through the park, he was captivated by the simplicity of it, the trees swaying in the breeze, the laughter of children, and the sight of a young boy darting through the grass. The boy's laugh was what first drew Jackson's attention. It was bright, infectious, and oddly familiar. Jackson stopped mid-stride, watching the child weave in and out of view. There was something strikingly familiar about the boy's features, his dark hair, sharp jawline, and almond-shaped eyes. Jackson shook his head, dismissing the thought as ridiculous. He couldn't possibly know this boy. But then he saw her, Cindy. She was sitting on a bench, her face tilted toward the sun, her auburn hair catching the light in the same mesmerizing way it had all those years ago. Jackson froze. Memories of their night together surged forward, her laughter, the way she had looked at him, and the way he had slipped out of her life without a second thought. He stepped closer, his breath hitching as the boy ran back toward her, wrapping his small arms around her waist. Cindy smiled down at him and brushed the stray hair from his face. For a moment Jackson couldn't breathe. The boy didn't just resemble him, he was practically a mirror image of his younger self. The realization hit Jackson like a thunderbolt, leaving him rooted to the spot. His heart raced as questions flooded his mind. Could it be possible? Was this child his? Cindy, unaware of Jackson's presence, gathered her things and called Ethan over. "Come on, sweetheart, let's head home," she said, her voice warm and full of love. Jackson watched them leave, his chest tightening with every step they took. He wanted to call out to stop her, but he couldn't find the words. All he could do was follow from a safe distance, his mind spinning. As Cindy and Ethan reached their modest apartment building, Jackson lingered across the street, his gaze fixed on the two of them. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. This wasn't just a coincidence, he needed answers. For the rest of the day, Jackson couldn't focus on anything else. His meetings blurred together, his mind replaying the image of the boy and the way Cindy had looked at him. That night he sat in his hotel room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The resemblance was undeniable. The next morning Jackson made a decision. He couldn't leave town without confronting Cindy and finding out the truth. The past he thought he had buried was about to resurface, and for the first time in years Jackson felt a pang of uncertainty, a feeling he wasn't accustomed to. As he prepared himself for the confrontation, a part of him wondered how Cindy would react. Would she welcome him with answers, or would she shut him out entirely? Either way, Jackson knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Something about that boy, his son, if his instincts were correct, made it impossible to turn back. Jackson Peters sat in his sleek rental car, parked just down the street from Cindy's apartment building. The early morning sunlight filtered through the windshield, but Jackson barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the child he had seen the day before. The resemblance was undeniable, and the possibility that the boy could be his gnawed at him. He wasn't a man who let things linger. He thrived on action, on solving problems swiftly and decisively. But this wasn't a business deal he could negotiate or a challenge he could outsmart. This was personal. For hours he debated his next move. Should he knock on her door? Would she even talk to him? What if the boy wasn't his? The thought almost made him laugh. If not mine, then whose, he wondered, the boy's striking features replaying in his mind. Unable to sit idle any longer, Jackson stepped out of the car, adjusting his tie as if it could shield him from the storm brewing inside. The cool morning air did little to steady his nerves as he approached the building. He hesitated at the door, staring at the buzzer panel. Cindy's name wasn't listed. She had always been private, a detail he hadn't appreciated back then. A woman exited the building, holding the door open for him, and Jackson slipped inside with a polite nod. His polished shoes echoed softly on the worn staircase as he climbed, unsure of which door was hers. He stopped on the second floor, listening intently for any sound that might guide him. Suddenly, a familiar laugh echoed through the hallway. He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It was his boy, laughing over something. Jackson followed the sound to an open window where voices filtered out into the quiet morning. "Mom, look at this," Ethan's voice called out. Jackson froze, his heart pounding as he peered discreetly through the window. Cindy stood in their small kitchen flipping pancakes while Ethan eagerly pointed to something in a book. She looked serene, her hair tied up in a loose bun, her face glowing with the contentment of someone immersed in motherhood. Watching them like this felt wrong, intrusive, but Jackson couldn't bring himself to look away. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of a decision he hadn't even realized he had made all those years ago. He had walked away without a backward glance, and now he stood on the edge of a reality that could shatter everything he thought he knew about his life. He pulled back from the window, conflicted. His instinct told him to knock on the door and demand answers, but a deeper, quieter voice urged patience. Cindy deserved more than his sudden reappearance and accusations. He needed to approach this carefully to understand her perspective before confronting her. Instead of knocking, Jackson retreated to his car. He spent the rest of the day digging into his memories of that night. How had he missed the signs? Cindy had been magnetic, her laughter intoxicating. He had told himself that leaving her was the right thing to do, that their connection was fleeting and best left as a beautiful memory. But now, 8 years later, that decision haunted him. Later that evening, Jackson sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. He had managed to track down Cindy's contact information, but every time he started to dial her number, he hesitated. What would he even say? "Hi, Cindy. Remember me? I think that kid of yours is mine." It sounded ridiculous even in his head. As night fell, Jackson's frustration grew. He wasn't a man who second-guessed himself, but Cindy's presence and that of her son had shaken him to his core. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the same drink he had ordered on the night they met, and stared out the window at the quiet town. The next morning, Jackson made a decision. He would confront Cindy, but he wouldn't come at her with accusations or demands. He needed to understand why she had never contacted him. He needed to hear her side of the story. With a renewed sense of purpose, he left the hotel, his mind racing. As he drove toward her apartment, the image of the boy's face lingered in his mind as clear as day. This wasn't just about answers anymore. It was about responsibility, about finally facing the consequences of a night he had long buried in the past. Jackson didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. Cindy Walters was used to the rhythm of her life, a life she had carefully built to ensure stability for herself and her son. As she left the grocery store that morning, carrying 2 bags of essentials, she hummed softly to herself, thinking of Ethan waiting at home. It was a chilly morning, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her, her breath visible in the crisp air. She had no idea that everything she had worked so hard to maintain was about to shift. As she approached her apartment building, she noticed a figure leaning casually against the fence by the front entrance. At first she thought nothing of it, just another passerby. But as she got closer, the figure straightened and her steps faltered. Her heart seemed to skip a beat when she recognized the man standing there. Jackson Peters. It took a moment for her mind to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. He looked older than she remembered, more polished, with a confidence that seemed to radiate from him. His tailored coat and neatly combed hair contrasted starkly with the small-town atmosphere, making him stand out just as much as he had years ago. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Cindy clutched her grocery bags tighter, her knuckles white, unsure whether to turn around or march forward. Jackson spoke first, his voice soft but steady. "Cindy," he said, his eyes searching hers. "It's been a while." She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone defensive. "I think you know why I'm here," Jackson replied, his gaze unwavering. Cindy's stomach churned. She knew this moment would come eventually. She had always feared it in the back of her mind, but now that it was here she wasn't prepared. She adjusted the grocery bags in her hands, trying to appear composed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, brushing past him and heading for the door. Jackson didn't move. "Cindy, wait," he called after her. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that demanded attention without raising volume. Reluctantly, she stopped and turned, her expression hard. "What do you want, Jackson? After all these years, why now?" He stepped closer, hands in his coat pockets, as if trying to keep himself from saying too much too soon. "I saw you at the park, and your son," he said, his words deliberate. "I need to know the truth, Cindy." Her heart dropped, and she felt the heat rising in her face. "The truth?" she echoed, trying to sound incredulous but failing. "Yes," Jackson said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Is he mine?" The air between them grew heavy with tension. Cindy's mind raced as she struggled to maintain her composure. She wanted to deny it, to tell him to leave and never come back. But she knew lying wouldn't make him go away, not now that he had seen Ethan. "What does it matter?" she finally said, her voice tight. "You weren't around then, and you're not needed now." Jackson flinched at her words, but didn't back down. "Cindy, I didn't know. If I had—" He paused, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of his own emotions. "If I had known, things would have been different." Cindy let out a bitter laugh. "Different? Really? You don't know the first thing about me or my son. You walked away, Jackson. You don't get to just show up and act like you care now." "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice softer. "But I'm here now. I want to do what's right." She shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. "What's right? You think you can waltz back into my life and fix everything?" "It's not that simple, Jackson. You don't get to come here and turn our lives upside down." Jackson took a deep breath, his expression earnest. "I'm not here to ruin anything, Cindy. I need to know him. I need to know the truth." For a long moment they stared at each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Cindy sighed and turned toward the door. "You have no idea what you're asking for," she said quietly. Before Jackson could respond, she disappeared into the building, leaving him standing outside in the cold, uncertain of what to do next. For the first time in years, Jackson felt powerless. He had come here seeking answers, but he was beginning to realize that finding the truth might cost him more than he had anticipated. The days following their confrontation were heavy with silence. Jackson could hardly think about anything else, the memory of Cindy's words echoing in his mind. "You weren't around then, and you're not needed now." He had expected resistance, but the rawness in her voice, the years of hurt, was something he hadn't prepared for. He wasn't one to back down from challenges, but this was different. This was personal, and it was clear Cindy had buried her anger for a long time. Jackson spent the next several days in town, staying in a hotel just a few blocks away from Cindy's apartment. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. His thoughts were consumed by the question of whether Ethan was his son, and if so, what that meant for the life he had built. He started by reaching out to old contacts, people from the past who might have crossed paths with Cindy or had information about her life since that night. Most people remembered her as a quiet, independent woman who kept to herself, someone who worked hard and rarely asked for help. But there were a few whispers, snippets of conversations, things Jackson didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. The information he gathered told him everything he needed to know, Cindy had kept Ethan's paternity a secret. She had never told anyone about their one night together. Jackson's stomach twisted as he realized how much she must have suffered in silence. She hadn't just raised her son alone. She had done so without the support of the man who might have been the father, a man who had been completely unaware of his existence. One evening, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Jackson decided to confront Cindy again. This time, however, he wouldn't just ask, he would have answers. He had hired a private investigator, a quiet, meticulous man who had discreetly obtained records and traced Cindy's past actions. The investigator had come back with the confirmation Jackson had feared. Ethan was indeed his son. The boy's birth certificate listed Jackson's name as the father, a revelation that felt like a punch to the gut. As Jackson sat in his hotel room, staring at the document in front of him, a wave of guilt and disbelief washed over him. For 8 years he had been absent from his son's life, living with the knowledge that he could have been a father but had chosen not to be. He had no idea what he was walking into when he confronted Cindy earlier. But now, with the truth laid out before him, he knew what he had to do. The next day, he made his way to Cindy's apartment. He didn't knock this time, he couldn't. Instead, he stood outside, staring at the building, battling the storm inside his chest. He didn't know if Cindy would even let him in after their last encounter. But he couldn't leave without seeing her, without explaining himself, and above all, without meeting his son. Cindy opened the door after several minutes, her face guarded but weary. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him, eyes filled with weariness and resignation. Jackson took a step forward, holding out the birth certificate in his hand. "I know," he said, his voice raw. "I know he's mine." Cindy's face paled as she took the paper, her eyes scanning it quickly. Her lips trembled, and for a moment Jackson thought she might something, maybe even shout at him. But she didn't. She simply nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the apartment was quiet, and Cindy's warm, inviting atmosphere was still present, despite the tension between them. Ethan's toys were scattered across the living room, a clear sign of a child's presence. Jackson's gaze softened as he took in the sight of his son's world, the world he had never been a part of. "I didn't want this for him," Cindy finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I didn't want him to grow up with a man who wasn't there. I wanted him to have a chance, Jackson, a chance at a normal life, free from the baggage of things that weren't his fault." Jackson swallowed hard, guilt eating away at him. He couldn't imagine what Cindy had gone through all these years, raising a child on her own, never once allowing him the opportunity to be a part of it. "I never wanted to be that man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know, Cindy. If I had known, things would have been different." Cindy looked at him for a long moment, her eyes hard, but with something softer flickering beneath. "You can't change the past, Jackson, and I can't change the way things happened. But you can start by being here now." As she spoke, the sound of small footsteps echoed from the hallway. Ethan appeared in the doorway, looking up at Jackson curiously. The boy had his mother's smile, but Jackson's eyes, a striking mirror of his own younger self. Ethan hesitated for a moment before walking up to Cindy's side, his small hand clutching hers tightly. Jackson knelt down to meet his son's gaze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hey there," Jackson said softly. Ethan stared at him for a moment, unsure of what to make of the stranger before him. But something in Jackson's voice, the way he looked at him, seemed to put him at ease. He slowly extended his hand, his tiny fingers brushing Jackson's. For the first time in 8 years, Jackson Peters felt like a father. Cindy paced her small living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ethan was playing in his room, blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing in her mind. Jackson had left hours ago after an awkward yet tender moment with their son, but Cindy couldn't shake the unease settling deep in her stomach. She couldn't deny it anymore. Jackson knew the truth, and the way he looked at Ethan made it clear he wasn't going to walk away this time. But what did that mean for her, for her son? For 8 years she had been everything to Ethan, his mother, his father, his safe place. Now Jackson wanted to wedge himself into their lives, and Cindy wasn't sure she could trust him not to leave again. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, already guessing who it might be. Sure enough, Jackson's name flashed on the screen. With a deep sigh, she answered. "Cindy," he began, his tone calm but firm. "We need to talk." "We already talked," she replied curtly, leaning against the counter. "Not enough," Jackson said, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "I want to be part of Ethan's life. I deserve that." Cindy's grip on the phone tightened. "Deserve? You don't get to walk back in after 8 years and demand anything. I've been the one raising him, Jackson. I've been the one sacrificing." "I'm not denying that," Jackson replied, his voice softening. "But I can't change the past, Cindy. All I can do is try to be there for him now. Isn't that what's best for Ethan?" Cindy's chest tightened at his words. Of course she wanted what was best for her son. She wanted him to have everything she hadn't growing up, including a father. But trusting Jackson felt like handing over a piece of her heart only to risk having it shattered again. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," Jackson said finally, "but I'm asking you to give me a chance. Let me prove to you and to Ethan that I'm here to stay." Cindy closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "Fine," she said after a long silence. "But on my terms. You don't get to disrupt his life. If I see even a hint that you're going to hurt him, Jackson, you're gone. Do you understand?" "I understand," Jackson said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you, Cindy. I won't let you down." The days that followed were cautious and tense. Cindy allowed Jackson to spend time with Ethan, but only under her watchful eye. At first, Ethan was shy around him, unsure of what to make of this new presence in their lives. But Jackson's patience and gentle approach slowly began to break down the barriers. They started with simple outings, trips to the park, ice cream runs, and walks around town. Cindy always stayed nearby, observing their interactions with a mixture of suspicion and hope. She couldn't deny that Ethan seemed happier, his laughter louder, his smiles brighter. He was bonding with Jackson in a way she hadn't expected, and it terrified her. One evening, after a particularly joyful day at the park, Ethan ran up to Cindy, holding a drawing he had made. It was a crude but heartfelt picture of the three of them standing together, hand in hand. Cindy's throat tightened as she looked at it, the simplicity of her son's wish for a family tugging at her heartstrings. "Do you like it, Mommy?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide with hope. Cindy nodded, forcing a smile. "I love it, sweetheart." Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Cindy sat alone in the living room, staring at the drawing. She wanted to believe that Jackson had changed, that he was ready to be the father Ethan deserved. But her fears wouldn't let her rest. What if he got bored? What if his sudden sense of responsibility faded as quickly as it had come? Cindy couldn't afford to let her guard down, not when Ethan's happiness and her own was at stake. The next morning, Jackson showed up at their apartment with a hesitant smile and a bag of groceries. "I thought I'd help out," he said, his tone almost sheepish. Cindy raised an eyebrow but let him in. As she watched him unpack the groceries, chatting with Ethan about the ingredients for pancakes, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. But hope, she reminded herself, could be dangerous. She would take this one step at a time for Ethan's sake. And for her own. The soft sound of Ethan's laughter drifted through the open window, mixing with the rustling leaves of the late afternoon breeze. Jackson sat cross-legged on the grass, a soccer ball at his feet and an uncharacteristically wide smile on his face. He wasn't sure how long it had been since he had felt this kind of pure, unfiltered joy. Watching Ethan race across the yard, his face lit up with excitement, Jackson realized just how much he had been missing. "Come on, Dad," Ethan called out, his voice full of giddy energy. The word Dad made Jackson freeze for a moment, his chest tightening. It was the first time Ethan had called him that. The boy had said it so naturally, as though it was something he'd been saying for years. "I'm coming for you," Jackson shouted back, standing up and chasing after Ethan. The boy squealed with laughter, dodging and weaving as Jackson tried and failed to steal the ball from him. Eventually, Ethan managed to kick it straight into a makeshift goal they had set up with 2 sticks. He threw his arms into the air, cheering for himself. "You're getting too good at this," Jackson said, playfully ruffling Ethan's hair. I know, Ethan said proudly. Mom says I'm a natural. At the mention of Cindy, Jackson's smile faltered for a brief moment. He glanced toward the house where she sat on the porch, watching them with a careful, guarded expression. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. It was as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Jackson to make a mistake and prove her fears right. He couldn't blame her. He had left before, and in doing so left her to handle everything on her own. But now, seeing the way Ethan looked up at him, Jackson knew he couldn't let that happen again. He had missed so much already, Ethan's first steps, his first words, the years of memories he could never get back. After the game, they sat on the grass, sharing a bag of snacks Jackson had brought. Ethan was a talkative boy, full of stories about school, his friends, and his favorite cartoons. Jackson listened intently, marveling at how much personality could be packed into such a small person. You know, Jackson said, trying to keep his tone casual, when I was your age, I used to love soccer too. I wasn't nearly as good as you, though. Really? Ethan's eyes lit up with curiosity. Did you play a lot? All the time, Jackson replied. I even thought about playing professionally when I grew up. What happened? Ethan asked. Jackson hesitated. How could he explain the choices, the sacrifices, and the mistakes that had led him to this point? Life happened, he said finally, offering Ethan a small smile. But it's okay. Things worked out in other ways. Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and started talking about his own dreams of being a famous soccer player one day. Jackson couldn't help but smile. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Cindy finally called Ethan inside. Dinner's almost ready, she said. Her voice carrying across the yard, Ethan jumped to his feet and ran toward the house, leaving Jackson sitting alone in the quiet yard. After a moment, Cindy came out to where he sat, her arms crossed over her chest. He had fun today, she said, her tone neutral. I did too, Jackson admitted, standing up and brushing the grass off his pants. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Thank you for letting me spend time with him. Cindy looked at him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. You're good with him, she said finally. Better than I expected. I'm trying, Jackson said softly. I know I have a lot to make up for. Cindy nodded but didn't reply. Instead, she turned back toward the house, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. That night, as Jackson lay in his hotel room, he replayed the day's events in his mind. The sound of Ethan's laughter, the warmth of his smile, the way he had called him Dad. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. For the first time, Jackson felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could piece together the family he never knew he wanted. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Cindy's walls were still firmly in place, and earning her trust would take more than a few afternoons in the park. Still, Jackson was determined. This wasn't just about making up for the past, it was about building a future. One that included not just Ethan, but Cindy too, if she could ever forgive him. Cindy's week began like any other, school drop-offs, work shifts, and trying to keep the delicate balance of her carefully constructed life. But by Thursday morning, everything shattered. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and sorting through a small pile of mail, she froze when her eyes landed on a crisp white envelope stamped with a law firm's logo. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The official language was cold and clinical, but the message was clear. Jackson was seeking legal custody of Ethan. Cindy's breath caught in her throat, and a wave of anger and panic swept over her. She felt the walls of her world closing in, the fear she had buried for weeks clawing its way to the surface. She slammed the letter onto the table and gripped the edge of her chair, trying to steady herself. He had promised, he had said he wouldn't disrupt Ethan's life. And yet here it was, proof that Jackson was doing exactly what she had feared. By the time she got to her phone, her anger had boiled over. She dialed Jackson's number, her grip on the phone tightening with every ring. He answered on the third. Cindy, he began, but she didn't let him finish. What the hell is this, Jackson? She demanded, her voice sharp. A custody agreement? Are you seriously trying to take my son from me? Cindy, calm down, Jackson said, his tone measured but tense. I'm not trying to take him from you. I want to make sure I'm part of his life. Officially. Officially, Cindy's voice broke as her emotions overwhelmed her. You think a piece of paper changes anything? You can't just waltz in here and act like you're entitled to him. You've been here for 5 minutes, Jackson. 5 minutes, and now you think you can dictate what's best for Ethan. Jackson sighed heavily. I'm not trying to dictate anything. I've hired lawyers because I want to protect my rights as his father. I don't want you to think I'll just disappear again. I'm here to stay, Cindy laughed bitterly. This isn't about rights, Jackson. This is about control. You couldn't handle me making the rules, so now you're dragging lawyers into this? Do you have any idea what this is doing to me? To him? I don't want to fight you, Jackson said softly. But I also can't sit back and hope you let me into his life. I need to know I have a legal right to be there. Don't you see? This isn't just about me, it's about Ethan. He deserves to know his father. Cindy clenched her jaw, tears stinging her eyes. Ethan has a father. He's had one every single day of his life. Me. She hung up before Jackson could respond, slamming the phone onto the table. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Cindy couldn't focus at work, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She imagined courtrooms, custody battles, lawyers tearing her apart for being a single mother. The thought of losing Ethan, even partially, was unbearable. When she picked Ethan up from school, he immediately noticed her strained demeanor. Are you okay, Mommy? He asked, his small hand clutching hers. I'm fine, sweetheart, Cindy lied, forcing a smile. Just a long day. But that night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, her resolve cracked. She sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his hair and holding back tears. Ethan, she began softly, how do you feel about Jackson spending time with us? Ethan looked up at her, his big eyes thoughtful. He's nice, he said after a moment. I like playing with him, but I like it when it's just us two. Cindy nodded, her heart aching at his innocence. I want you to be happy, Ethan. That's all that matters to me. As she left his room, she sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the custody letter once more. Cindy knew she couldn't avoid this fight, but she also couldn't let fear control her. If Jackson wanted a battle, she would be ready. The next day, Cindy met with a lawyer, laying everything out on the table. She explained Jackson's sudden reappearance, his demands, and the turmoil it had caused. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Abigail, listened carefully and nodded. We'll fight this, Cindy, Abigail said firmly. You've been Ethan's sole parent for 8 years. The courts don't take that lightly. Jackson may be his biological father, but custody isn't just about biology. It's about what's best for the child. And from what you've told me, that's you. Cindy exhaled slowly, relief mingling with her lingering fear. For the first time since receiving the letter, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't going to let Jackson take away the life she had built. If he wanted to prove himself, he would have to do it on her terms, not with lawyers, but with actions. As Cindy prepared for the battle ahead, she couldn't help but wonder if Jackson truly understood what he was asking for, or the price they would all pay for his decision. Cindy had spent the entire weekend steeling herself for the inevitable court battle, but by Monday morning her doorbell rang, and instead of a legal notice or another heated confrontation, it was Jackson. His expression was different this time, softer, almost apologetic. Cindy opened the door reluctantly, folding her arms across her chest as she blocked the entrance. What do you want, Jackson? She asked, her tone weary. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice calm and deliberate. Please, just hear me out. She hesitated, her instincts warning her to protect the fragile bubble she had built around her and Ethan. But there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside and let him in. Jackson walked into the living room, pausing briefly to glance at the family photos on the wall. His eyes lingered on a picture of Cindy holding Ethan as a baby, their smiles wide and bright. It hit him how much of his son's life he had missed, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on his chest. I shouldn't have involved lawyers, Jackson began, turning to face her. I see that now, I panicked Cindy. I didn't know how else to show you that I'm serious about being here for Ethan. But I realize now that I went about it the wrong way. Cindy raised an eyebrow, skeptical of his sudden change of heart. So what? You're just going to drop the custody case? Yes, Jackson said without hesitation. I've already instructed my lawyers to withdraw everything. This isn't about courts or papers, Cindy. It's about earning your trust and being the father Ethan deserves. Cindy blinked, caught off guard by his admission. She had braced herself for a fight, but this was the last thing she expected. And why should I believe you? She asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. How do I know you won't change your mind the second things get hard? Jackson took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he considered her words. Because I've changed, he said finally. Seeing Ethan spending time with him, it's made me realize what I've been missing. I don't want to be the man who walks away again. I can't be. Cindy wanted to believe him, but her walls were still firmly in place. Actions speak louder than words, Jackson, she said, crossing her arms again. You've made promises before, but I'm not going to gamble with my son's happiness. I don't expect you to believe me right away, Jackson admitted. But let me prove it to you, Cindy. Let me show you that I'm here for the long haul. Before Cindy could respond, Ethan burst into the room, his face lighting up when he saw Jackson. You're here, Ethan exclaimed, running over to him. Jackson knelt down, catching Ethan in a hug. Of course I'm here, buddy, he said, his voice warm. I wouldn't miss seeing you for the world. Cindy watched the interaction, her heart softening despite herself. She couldn't deny the bond forming between them, and part of her wanted to give Jackson the chance he was asking for. But the fear of being let down still loomed large. After Ethan returned to his room, Cindy turned back to Jackson. If you're serious about this, then it's going to take time, she said firmly. No grand gestures, no shortcuts. Just show up consistently. Be there for Ethan, and maybe eventually I'll start to trust you again. Jackson nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. I'll do whatever it takes, he promised. Over the next few weeks, Jackson kept his word. He showed up every day, sometimes to take Ethan to school, other times to help him with his homework or play soccer in the yard. Cindy watched from a distance, her guarded heart slowly beginning to thaw. One evening, as they all sat down for dinner, a rare moment of shared family time, Ethan looked up from his plate and grinned. This is nice, he said. It feels like we're a real family. Cindy's breath caught in her throat, her eyes meeting Jackson's across the table. She saw the same emotion reflected in his gaze, a mixture of hope and longing. After dinner, as Jackson prepared to leave, Cindy walked him to the door. For the first time in weeks, her tone softened. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? Jackson asked, surprised. For trying, she replied. For showing up. For making Ethan smile. Jackson nodded, his chest tightening at her words. It's just the beginning, he said. I'm not going anywhere. As Cindy closed the door behind him, she leaned against it, her mind racing. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of hope, not just for Ethan, but for herself. Maybe, just maybe, Jackson was telling the truth, and maybe against all odds, they could find a way to heal what had been broken. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of Cindy's small kitchen as the smell of pancakes filled air. Ethan sat at the table, swinging his legs and chatting animatedly about his soccer practice. Cindy listened with a faint smile, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Over the past few weeks, Jackson's consistency had begun to chip away at her guarded walls, but she still wrestled with the fear of the unknown. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Ethan hopped off his chair, eager to see who it was. Cindy followed him to the door, her pulse quickening. She didn't need to guess it was Jackson. Morning, Jackson greeted with a smile, holding a small box wrapped in colorful paper. Thought I'd stop by and bring Ethan something. What is it? Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up. Open it and see, Jackson replied, handing the box to him. Ethan tore into the paper, revealing a new soccer ball with his name printed on it. His excitement was infectious, and he threw his arms around Jackson. Thanks, Dad, he exclaimed. Cindy froze at the word Dad. It wasn't the first time Ethan had called him that, but the ease with which it rolled off his tongue still caught her off guard. She glanced at Jackson, who met her gaze with an expression that mixed pride and gratitude. Breakfast is almost ready, Cindy said, stepping aside to let Jackson in. They sat together at the table, sharing a meal in an atmosphere that felt surprisingly normal. Cindy watched as Jackson and Ethan chatted, the dynamic between them becoming more natural with each passing day. It was moments like these that made her wonder if she could let her guard down entirely. After breakfast, the three of them headed to the park. Ethan ran ahead, kicking his new soccer ball, while Jackson and Cindy followed behind at a slower pace. "You've been showing up," Cindy said, her tone more conversational than guarded. "I told you I would," Jackson replied, his hands in his pockets. Cindy hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's different now, seeing how much Ethan lights up when you're around." "I can't deny it's good for him," Jackson nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "I just want to do right by him and by you, Cindy. I know I've hurt you and I can't change the past, but I want to be here now for both of you." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "Jackson, I've spent years protecting myself and Ethan. I can't just forget how hard it's been or how much I've had to sacrifice." "I'm not asking you to forget," Jackson said softly. "But maybe we can start over. Not as strangers, but as two people who want the best for their son. And maybe, if you're willing, we can build something from there." Cindy looked at him, her expression unreadable. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of the past ran deep. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," Jackson replied, his eyes steady. "But I'm willing to take it one step at a time. No pressure, no rush, just hope." They continued walking in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. But for the first time, Cindy felt a flicker of possibility, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. At the park, Ethan called out to them, waving excitedly. "Come on, you two, let's play." Cindy smiled despite herself and jogged over to join him. Jackson followed, his heart swelling as he watched the two people he cared about most in the world laughing together. As the day went on, the tension between Cindy and Jackson began to ease, replaced by something lighter, more tentative. Cindy found herself relaxing, her laughter more frequent, her smiles less forced. She still wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, she was willing to take things as they came. That evening, as they walked back to Cindy's apartment, Ethan held both their hands, swinging between them. The sight warmed Cindy's heart, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have a real family. When they reached the apartment, Jackson lingered at the door, his hesitation evident. "I'll see you tomorrow?" he asked, his tone hopeful. Cindy nodded, surprising herself. "Yeah, tomorrow." As Jackson walked away, Ethan tugged at her hand. "Mom, do you think Dad will come to my soccer game next week?" Cindy knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's face. "I think he will," she said, her voice steady. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Cindy sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the day. She still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. Maybe the past couldn't be erased, and maybe forgiveness wouldn't come easily. But as she thought about Jackson's determination and Ethan's happiness, she realized that sometimes starting over wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about building something new, one step at a time. And for now, that was enough. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.